So good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the organizers for the invitation and for making it possible. And it's an exciting thing during the pandemic to be in Jerusalem, although virtually. Um, and I see that there are some good friends here, and I'm not sure if I'm going to surprise you with something. It is a general introductory lecture to the topic, to our today's topic, which is Debora Vogel and her artistic milieu in the interwar Lwów. I'll start by sharing my screen here. And before we start our discussion, I'll just introduce myself perhaps, and before I share the screen maybe. So my name is Karolina Szymaniak, and I'm a professor of Yiddish studies at the Wrocław University in Poland and a research fellow at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, Poland. And my main areas of research are modern Yiddish literature and the avant-garde. That's how I started my academic career. My first book concerned Warsaw Yiddish avant-garde, and my first monograph was devoted to Debora Vogel and was published 15 years ago. At that time, nobody actually was interested in this writer and intellectual. Right now, we are in a very exciting moment when a lot of translators, researchers are interested in her as a writer, as an art critic, and as an interesting, fascinating figure of the pre-war Lviv artistic scene. So here is the presentation. Hopefully everything will go well. Right. Okay, right. So let's meet the person. So here is the one photo that for long has been the only photo, I mean, was actually already, was the only photo of her known, published mainly in the publications devoted to a Jewish Polish writer, modernist writer, Bruno Schulz. That's how she was known to the world, through the Bruno Schulz connection and as his muse, as a femme inspiratrice, but not as a writer and intellectual in her own rights. So I kept looking and found this photo while I was working on an exhibition devoted to her that was organized in Łódź, in Museum of Art in Łódź in 2017, that I co-curated with two of my colleagues, the Lviv artist Andrei Boyarov and Pavel Polit, the curator of the museum. That's another photography of her that comes from her university papers. This was actually a photography for her professor, Kazimierz Twardowski, a famous philosopher. I will briefly later explain the connection. Later, here is a portrait, actually a lost portrait. It's a copy of a portrait made by an avant-garde Polish painter, Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz, known also as Witkacy, who was Vogel's close friend. The latest research on Vogel reveals that she, as a very young student, was already interested in the very complex philosophy of Witkacy, was not only a painter, but also a philosopher. And as a young girl of 21, she started her polemics with the philosopher. So she was a courageous thinker and also interested not only in the art, but also in philosophy. Here is a portrait that was lost. We have only a copy of it. And she kept sending this portrait. So that's why I'm sharing this portrait with you, to all her friends, demanding actually comments on the portrait. She was very excited about the portrait. And here's what she wrote to Moshe Starkman in New York. I sent you my picture, a photo of my portrait where I look like a young lady from Tahiti. And I'm anxiously waiting to hear what you think. And then when she doesn't get any feedback, she asks again and again. And she thought this portrait is painted in the manner that, the farther from the original, the better. So Witkacy kept, he had this style of portraiting different artists in different manners, and sometimes they were really realistic portraits and sometimes they were not. And Vogel was actually really making fun of her own appearances, and it seems like a marginal thing, but actually her femininity her being a woman writer was one of the main marginalizing factors, and the fact that led to her really exclusion from the history of literature and art in both Poland and elsewhere. Vogel, treated as this muse, had no intellectual independence. She herself, together with another Jewish writer from Lwów, Rachel Auerbach, if you will, who is best known as one of the 3 surviving members of the Oynek Shabbos archive. They were making fun of their own appearances and thinking that this is something that being a beautiful woman in the public sphere really does not help a woman to be seen as an intellectual. So they were together writing a tractate or a manifesto of female ugliness, which tells you how conscious she was about her own position in the pre-war public sphere. She was also economically marginalized, as many actively writing women, that she was not paid for what she was writing, not properly paid, etc., etc. But there were other factors for her marginalization, and one is visible here. You see that these words were written originally in Yiddish, not in any other languages, possibly Polish. She actually came from a very old Lwów family. I know it's a terrible photo and you can't see anything, but I wanted to share it just to explain who she was, where she came from. So she was born in 1900 in a Galician shtetl of Bursztyn, into a Zionist family. Her father, seen here, I'm not sure if you can see actually my cursor, but I don't know, I can't share it, but here, standing here, this is the second person from the left standing here. Her father, Angel Vogel, was a director of Baron Hirsch school. Her mother was also a teacher. The family was a wealthy family. Her mother came from a very famous Ehrenpreis family, a bourgeois family from Lwów. Vogel's uncle, Markus Ehrenpreis, later became an important figure in Swedish Judaism, but also an important writer, Zionist writer as such. Here you see David Malt, who was also a lawyer and a Zionist activist in Galicia. Here you see his daughter, Judita Malt, who was a young Hashomer Hatzair activist, and she died in Eretz Israel in 1929, very early, of malaria. Vogel was also, very close to her cousin herself. She herself was active in Hashomer Hatzair movement in her youth. In Bursztyn, this is not very clear, but for sure in Vienna, when the family fled Bursztyn to Vienna during the First World War, as many with other refugees, then the family moved to Hungary. This was a typical route for First World War refugees. At that time, Vogel herself stayed in Vienna, and she was educated there in a German gymnasium. She graduated from this gymnasium, and then when they came back to Lwów at that time in the Polish Republic, she graduated from the Polish gymnasium and started her studies at the Jan Kazimierz University in Lwów. As you can imagine, the family was actually not actively promoting Yiddish. The family was Polish speaking. They also spoke Hebrew. Vogel was able to write in Hebrew. Actually, there are some texts of her that she wrote in Hebrew. There is a correspondence held by the National Library of Israel of hers, also in Hebrew. She knew also German, so she was a typical representative of Jewish intelligentsia from Galicia, speaking multiple languages and being engaged in many cultures, both the modern Polish Jewish culture, Polish culture, Hebrew culture, and German culture. Her debut, her literary debut, she was actually a Zionist short story published in a Zionist magazine called The Messiah. And it was, she actually reworked a part of Gratz history of the Jews. And this is actually the story of the Bar Kokhba uprising into a modern prose montage-like story. This is a story she published when she was 19. We can think about, that she was encouraged by her family that was engaged actively in promoting the Zionist movement. But it was not Polish and not Zionist writing that became the most important part of her literary activity. It was Yiddish. And this is not a very obvious choice for a girl coming from such a family. Here you can see her, or you can't, and you can see her picture. This is her student book, student ID held by the State Archives in Lwów, and her portrait here. This girl who started her studies in the philosophy and literature decided to write in Yiddish. Why did she? Maybe I'll come to another nice portrait of her, maybe here already after we're at the beginning of her academic career. Here she also already holds a PhD. So, so she starts her studies. She studies philosophy. She's interested in philosophy. She studies psychology, modern psychology, and literature. These are her main academic interests. And she will pursue a doctorate in philosophy. Actually, she's interested in Hegelian aesthetics. Very early on, she understands that she needs a philosophical background to understand whatever is happening in the art, in the visual arts that are also part of her broad, not university curriculum, but intellectual curriculum, what she is interested in, what she is interested in doing. And that's why she chooses to study Hegelian aesthetics, to understand the nature of the art process, the changes of the art process, how different styles can arise and come to an end, what are the tendencies in art, how to understand them, how to follow them, how to respond to them. And she writes her PhD about, that's the topic she chooses, but for different reasons, some of them have to do with her, with her professor she was studying with, Kazimierz Twardowski. She simply fails different exams. She moves from Lwów to Kraków, and she does her PhD in Kraków, still in Galicia, but her new supervisor wants her to write about Polish philosophy, and she's combining Polish philosophy with a Polish Jewish philosopher, Józef Kremer, and that's her topic of her PhD. But that's not enough for her. A PhD is not enough for her. This PhD is fairly well received. She presents it on a seminar. The results, the abstract, is published also in the proceedings of the Polish Academy of Sciences. So this is quite a success. We're in the mid-1920s. But before that, something else happened. So Vogel started to be interested in the Yiddish language and literature, something she did not know from home. Her bourgeois home was really hostile to the Yiddish culture. And one of the reasons, I mean, there are different reasons, personal reasons and aesthetic reasons. I will discuss the personal reasons right now, and we'll come back to aesthetic reasons later on, is that she meets during her studies Rachel Auerbach, who is an engaged Zionist and a fervent, ardent Yiddishist. And Auerbach is convinced that for Yiddish Jewish culture, national Jewish culture to thrive in the diaspora, one needs to promote the Yiddish language that is the expression of the modern Jewish culture. And she tries to convince many other Jewish intellectuals in Galicia who are basically and I mean, mostly Polish-speaking Galician Jewry. I mean, that would be an oversimplification, but the intellectual Galician, I mean, intellectual bourgeois, let's say, Galician Jews were Polish German speaking and not engaged in promoting Yiddish culture, which is an oversimplification because we have a very important Yiddishes coming from Galicia. And I will just mention one example, one really important example of Dr. Emanuel Ringelblum, the creator of the Oynek Shabbos, the clandestine ghetto archive in Warsaw, who was actively promoting Yiddish. So this is a very complex issue, but if you were thinking about Lwów and about different intellectuals, Yiddish was not an obvious choice for them. Auerbach convinces Vogel to write in Yiddish, and Vogel will struggle with this choice for her whole life. Firstly, this was not her mother tongue, so she was writing in a language that she had to learn. Of course, she knew German, which helped, and which did not help. So we see a lot of German influences in her Yiddish, and this is something that Yiddish readers kept criticizing. On the other hand, her audience in Lwów was mostly Polish speaking. So whenever she was lecturing in Yiddish, the audience that understood Yiddish, as she wrote to Bruno Schulz in one of her letters, did not understand her radical modernist ideas. On the other hand, the audience who did understand her modernist radical ideas did not understand the language. So she felt trapped. But she wrote very different things about her choice of language. So whenever she was in contact with Yiddish intellectuals, she would say that this is the language of the modernism. This is the international diasporic language that helps me capture the world, the processes of modernity on the universal international level. And she said that she's disappointed with the Polish artistic and literary milieu, and she doesn't want to write Polish. To Bruna Schulz, she writes that she wants to be a writer in Polish as well. And she doesn't invest, she writes to him, I don't invest enough time to be visible on the Polish artistic scene. So she became this bilingual writer, negotiating her position between the Yiddish, Polish Jewish, and Polish cultures, and trying to find a place for herself. But most of her work was in Yiddish. In Yiddish, she published all of her literary works. Part of it was also published in Polish, and in Yiddish and Polish, she published her art criticism and theoretical works. So she should be considered this Polish Yiddish Polish writer. For a long time, she was only known as an author of one book that was published in Polish. Today, she's rediscovered as a Yiddish writer, but her Polish work is right now somehow marginalized, and we cannot see her as a whole writer without these different languages. We can add here Hebrew, and I know that there is a ongoing project of translation of her works into Hebrew. She herself published a few things in Hebrew, as well as German. She started actually writing her first poems in German, and they were never published. So between these four languages, this is how this intellectual developed. And she developed in the city. I mean, she lived all her life in the city of Lwów. We're here. This is pre-war Poland, the Second Polish Republic. You can see at that time it was Lwów, today Lwów. So we're here on the map. Here you see the map of the city, not a very clear one. Lwów was the third biggest city in the interwar Poland. At the beginning of the interwar period, it had roughly, these are not very exact numbers, just to give you an idea, 200,000 inhabitants. And by the end of the period, the number raised to 320,000 inhabitants. It also, I mean, the number changed so dramatically also because the city grew. and the suburbs were incorporated into the city. The ethnic composition of the population, I'm not including all the minorities, only the three most important populations that actually influence the character of the city and its social and intellectual life. So roughly 50% it's Poles, 30% Jews, and 13 to 15% Ukrainians. I mean, these numbers also, it's hard sometimes to be very precise, but because some of these numbers depend on different censuses and different data. And sometimes people were asked about their religion. Sometimes they were asked also about their languages. In other censuses, they were not. So it's hard to give you precise numbers, but from here you have data from 1931 about languages, which were correlated with with religion. So Roman Catholics were mostly, almost entirely, this was a Polish-speaking population. It doesn't tell you about their national identity, but we can assume most of them identified as Poles. Then there were Greek Catholics, and they here the diversity of languages is bigger. So, but the most important language is here is Ukrainian, and then Jewish population with Yiddish as the central language, which doesn't tell you, I mean, I kept telling you that Yiddish was not so important in Lwów, and Lwów was for sure not a center of modern Yiddish culture. If we think about interwar Poland, and I'll come back to this map here, sorry about that. So the centers would be to the west, and to the north. So Warsaw, for example, here, Łódź, another Białystok, and Vilna. These would be the important centers of Yiddish culture. Lwów was not considered a center of Yiddish culture. It was considered, and I'm quoting here, the cursed nest of assimilation. And it's interesting because here really the engagement with Polish culture also was combined with the engagement in Zionism. So here also really the importance of Polish language. Hebrew here, when we are thinking about Hebrew speakers, this is more of a ideological declaration than an actual number of people who used Hebrew on the everyday basis, but they would use probably Hebrew during different meetings, lectures, etc. Vogel herself lectured both in Polish, in Yiddish, and in Hebrew in Lwów as well. So what was Lwów? I wrote in the introduction, in the abstract of this talk, that Lwów was a hub for everything modern. Was it actually? I'm asking this question. And here, I can't give you, I can't give really you the picture. It's a short lecture of what Lwów was. It was on the one hand a peripheral city. I'm not sure if we should actually use these categories of center and periphery, but these were also the categories in which Vogel thought, and she tried to redefine them. And this is also the category, these are the categories that some of the other important intellectuals who lived in Lwów used. So seemingly a peripheral city close to Vienna, closer to Vienna than to Warsaw, that developed in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 19th century and became and part of Poland after 1918, but this was not so straightforward because there were also, the city was also, and was at that time an important city for Ukrainian nationalism. The city was also, and it was at that time a Polish-Ukrainian war was ongoing, and then 1920 there was a Polish-Bolshevik war ongoing. So only after 1921 all the wars ended and the city became officially part of the Second Polish Republic. Important city for the free cultures, for the Ukrainian culture, for the Jewish culture, and for the Polish culture, for different reasons, and a city where all these three cultures and language and different languages, more than one Jewish language, met. Why was it important? Just to give you really, this is a short review and a very simplified review. So it was a university city. I told you the third biggest city in Poland. So in the realm of, in the field of philosophy, this was a site of the famous Polish philosophical school, Lwów, Warsaw, or Lwów, Warsaw, as it is known in English, School of Philosophy, with Professor Kazimierz Twardowski, who was actually Vogels' professor, and other important philosophers, logicians, etc. This is a school of analytic philosophy, also interested in phenomenology, and one of the best known schools of Polish philosophy in the world, really world famous. The same goes for the Lwów School of Mathematics, with such authors as Hugo, mathematicians, researchers, scientists as Hugo Steinhaus, Stefan Banach, or Stanisław Ulam, who later became a member of the Manhattan Project. In literature, really interesting theoreticians, but not so well known on the international arena, but really important figures, somewhat neglected today. Juliusz Kleiner, Ostap Ortwin, that is a pen name of Oskar Katzenelbogen, or Stefania Skwarczyńska, with the really modernist ideas about what literature is and what literary theory can be. This is where one of the places where modern literary theory, as we know it today, is born. In the realm of aesthetics, Leon Chwistek, who is a painter, mathematician, but also a philosopher of aesthetics, or such a figure as Roman Ingarden, who is probably the best known philosopher, Polish philosopher of the period. In the realm of music, Zofia Lisa, who was Vogel's close friend, who was a theoretician of music, who wrote about atonal music, cacophony, and so on and so on. So this is really the most modern ideas are discussed at the university, at the Jan Kazimierz University in Lwów. So when Vogel enters the university, it is a place, an exciting place to discuss these new ideas. And she joins this discussion very early on, as I told you. She's a very courageous and very independent thinker, and she is not afraid to really enter into polemics with established or better known intellectuals, philosophers. And that's a really fascinating moment to think about this young girl who reads very heavy, very difficult authors and is ready to not only to discuss these ideas, but really to propose her own ideas or to counter the different solutions. And Lwów is also a city of arts. And again, I feel like there are so many authors in literature. There's so many authors in I mean, so many names I could cite in art or cinema, and I did not do it. Actually, I started first, citing different names, but this list of names probably to most of you will be just a list of names, and I have to convince you that these are exciting authors, avant-garde painters, writers, art and cinema critics, architects. Here you see one example. This is a project, a design of a hospital by Tadeusz Teodorowicz-Teodorowski, who was one of a group of very exciting modernist architects that changed the face of Lwów and modernized it. And you can still see this in the contemporary city of Lwów. In the music, for example, it's Józef Koffler, who met in Vienna, Alban Berg, who was experimenting with atonal compositions. And then later on, he himself started composing, thinking about atonality. And later he also started to experiment with dodecacophony. So very modern, things that were discussed in the realm of arts and realm of science and at that time happen also in Lwów. This is just to show you two projects by Teodorowicz, and one project here. Actually, this is an actual photo of an architect, a Jewish architect, Ferdinand Kassler. Here, this is a contemporary photo from Lwów. This was one of the most modern and exciting buildings at that time in Lwów that made it actually also to Vogel's writings. Because what is important here is that the city of Lwów together with other cities that became important for Vogel, defines her visual, her vision as an author, the way she writes, the way she tries to change the nature of the literary work and to make it more visual. So one of the major factors influencing her thinking and her writing is the very substance of this modern city of Lwów, Lwów. So there are obviously different milieus at that time in the city, and one of the places where many intellectuals of that time, artists, writers meet is the studio of Wanda Diamant, herself a modernist photographer. Here we see memoirs of Ignacy Witz, a wonderful graphic artist, and a caricaturist who survived the war. And he remembers that this was one of the most internationalist homes, places in Lviv, where people from different nationalities met, where you could hear Yiddish, Polish, Ukrainian, Hebrew, German, and where you would think about modern art. So this is this milieu where Vogel develops later on as an art critic, as a writer, as a theoretician. A milieu that is a leftist milieu, that is not a nationalist milieu, where what is important is the investment in modern art and not your nationality, where Ukrainians, Poles, and Jews work together. And especially it's important when you think about the rising nationalism in Poland in the 1920s and 30s, especially, where Lviv artists actually, they establish a union of artists, of visual artists, that has no name Polish in it, and that is open to everybody, which is really, we have to remember, we have to think about the situation in the context, in the historical context. It does not mean that that the experience of anti-Semitism is not Vogel's experience. It is. 1918 is the time where, the Polish independence opens with a series of pogroms, and 1918 is the date of the pogrom in Lwów. And then Vogel experiences anti-Semitism, and she responds to it also in her writings, in her different press articles. And but she lives in a milieu that counters it. Of course, Lviv is also a site for nationalist fights and exclusion of Jewish students at the universities and other schools of higher education, and not only these schools. So this is her experience as well. But what is important is that this artistic milieu she is associated with is a different milieu. Here, if we're speaking about Lviv, I wanted to show you this postcard. This comes from her. This is her own postcard sent to a New York Yiddish writer, Aaron Glanz-Leyeles, and it's today kept in the YIVO archives in New York. I love this postcard because here you see her own writing, her own signature here. You can, if you can read Yiddish or Hebrew, you will see Debora Vogel written under this name Leopold Wały Hetmańskie. So here it says her Jewish signature, Yiddish signature, written on the image of the city she lived in. And it is written in Yiddish and not in Polish. And it somehow changes the way we understand the space also, her own representations of the space in the Yiddish language. I'll show you again one more photography. This is a photography I have thanks to Andrei Boyarov. This is the house on the right, the last house on the right. This is the house where she lived together with her husband who was an engineer, Shulim Barenblut. They had one kid. This was not an arranged marriage. it seems that it was not a very happy marriage, though they shared some interest in modern architecture, for example. He was an engineer, he was a constructor. They read, the papers, the journals that were available at Barenbloot's home were also papers that later on were reworked into different images in Vogel's writings. But Vogel originally was involved also romantically, it seems, with Bruno Schulz, but her mother thought that Bruno Schulz was not enough for her, a bourgeois daughter. Schulz was a poor art teacher in a school in Drohobycz, and the family was not happy with such a choice. So Vogel was married to an engineer. Here you see also her address. The Lwów address is Leśna 18, but it's written on another address of a literary journal that she co-edited with Rochel Auerbach, a journal in Yiddish, a modernist journal in Yiddish. Here you see the cover of the second issue of this journal. This was an idea that originated in late 1920s. The Yiddish writers and Jewish artists thought that this would be an interesting thing to create a space for modern Yiddish art in this Polonized city of Lwów. At that time it was Lwów. I keep reminding, I keep using the double name because it was a multilingual and multinational city. So here you see the name Zusteyer, a contribution. It was supposed to be a contribution to the new construction, the new building of the modern Yiddish culture in Lwów. But this project failed. Only 3 issues of the journal appeared, and due to different political disagreements, part of the group was not only leftist, but communist. And the disagreement here about the politics of the journal led to the dissolution of the group. Another important factor were the finances, the budget. So there was not enough money here. So the group was a failure. Many of the writers active in the group chose to move to Warsaw, for example, or to Vilna. So those big centers of Yiddish culture, to continue their work and to simply also have more opportunities to earn money. Vogel, however, she remained in Lwów. She was active also in the Polish Jewish public sphere, publishing in Polish Jewish journals. Rarely did she publish in Polish journals for the general public. So this is something that tells you also about her position. She did publish in one of the most important intellectual journals of the period, Wiadomości Literackie, which was really the main social and literary journal back then. But this was one-time thing. Most of her articles appeared in the Polish Jewish press, so the press that was written in Polish, but aimed mainly, not exclusively at the Jewish audience, but for sure read mainly by the Jewish audience, and in Yiddish, and some of them in Hebrew. So I kept telling you that Lwów was exciting at that time, but how did they think about it? So here you have a quote from a Lwów artist, Ludwik Lila, who was, between other things, he was also a student of Paul Klee, and he was also studying at the Bauhaus at a certain moment. So when he was reviewing the Lwów artistic scene in the 1935, he wrote an interesting sentence. Of course, that the rest of Poland lived another life, as if, Lwów was another space. In this peripheral space, it had another rhythm. Vogel herself also thought about her position as peripheral and central at the same time. Here you have one of her poems. In the original, it's called Bala de Paris. And it was translated by Anastasia Lubas, who edited a wonderful collection of Vogel's translations, both into Ukrainian and into English. And she's a researcher of Vogel's work. Here you see that there's another city appearing and on the scene in Vogel's writing, Paris, or Paris. I'm sorry, I was using the Yiddish pronunciation. So Paris was for Vogel the model of a modern metropolis that she was fascinated with. She was fascinated with urbanism. She thought that the experience of modern big city is something that should be a defining experience for a modern artist. So here in this particular poem, it's interesting how the proxemics or the space is represented, and how it is what is the value ascribed to the space. So she writes this: and one can forget the color, the style, and even the material of your necklaces, clothes, bridges, Paris. Paris, you are the city of colorful kitsch. And one can forget the velvet of sidewalks and pavements, Paris, Berlin, Stockholm, and cities I haven't seen. When you live in a country which is covered with fields, where cities are like fields of yellow boredom and purple potatoes. Oh, potato flowers have a sweet and subtle smell, and the horizon is not bedazzled with boulevards of the city fates. But somewhere there are quick-paced cities where the sticky subways can be like sweet dates and like cooling white linen. And you long for a city where people are fatigued and happy. Sticky subways and pavements, from sticky subways and pavements, that's my mistake, and 1,000 colorful shapes, materials and bridges over the green Seine. So here Paris appears as the center, and Poland, I mean, not mentioned here, but you have a country which is covered with fields of yellow boredom and purple potatoes. So this is Poland, the rural Poland. So Vogel positions herself as a subject in the periphery vis-a-vis those quick-paced cities that she names, Paris, Berlin, and Stockholm. These are the cities that she actually visited. Her family, as I mentioned, lived in Sweden, part of her family, her Aaron Price family. Berlin was the first city on her tour after her PhD or between actually her PhD, defense that she visited, and Paris was the city that she kept coming back to really refresh herself, to learn about new ideas in art, and to know what's going on in the world of art. I'm sorry, I have to. How do I do this? There's a technical problem that I can't solve. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'll try to start anew here. Can you see the presentation?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm sorry, because something. All right, okay. So coming back here. All right, so so here just a few words about her understanding of what urbanism and modern city is. So in a letter to Bruno Schultz, she wrote, "We need multiplicity. Urbanism is not a platitude. We should recreate ourselves with foreign cities." It's not an obvious slogan, recreate ourselves with foreign cities. So these are, this is a city, I mean, a big city, as you see, you get tired of it. That's the main experience she's trying to capture here in this Paris poem. But on the other hand, she understands that every time you need fresh ideas, you need to go to a foreign city. And then in another letter, she writes that we too have a certain measure of exoticness, arriving in the form of travel, of visiting unknown foreign cities and quarters, and in the form of unexpected encounters. And this journey doesn't necessarily have to encompass 6 months of distance in order to experience quintessentially its essence. And what is important here is that this city walk, the travel through an unknown quarter or through an unknown city, becomes the matter for the philosophy of modern life. It's very Benjaminian in a sense. I think Bogdan Shmulowicz is here, and perhaps he has something to say about it more than I do. But it feels very Benjaminian here, and the nature of her thinking of what, going through a city, what a city walk means for thinking and for art is very characteristic here. So it is through walking through the city that the art is born. The art is born out of this movement through the city, and that's what her writing is about: going through a city and understanding through these walks the nature of existence as such. And then, so she talks about those travels to other cities. She travels indeed to Paris, but she dreams of traveling to New York, where she never went, I think. She was also planning a trip to Eretz Israel, which never happened. But then again, she writes in another letter, no, one should not constantly be in a state of travel. The real tragic life goes on and is only possible in its tethering to one place, in taking root in a single atmosphere with its streets and cities, twilights and autumns. For only the stable bears fruit and a heavy monotony from which hard and glittering things are born alive. You might be surprised by the language here. It's a very peculiar language, a language that you will encounter also in her poems and in her prose writings. And this shows you, and in her press articles, this shows you that even though she was writing slightly differently in different discourses, her language that she developed is very coherent. And this was not only a mere experiment in rendering the language visual and in changing the nature of what a written or spoken word can be, mostly written, but this was a lived experience for her. And it's very important because she was criticized for what seemed to be a mere experiment and an artificial experiment, while she answered to this, that this is actually a life experiment. And this is something that, through writing, through thinking, she tried also to construct and to understand her own life and the life of her peers and the nature of the society and of the history that was happening on her before her eyes. So here she says, actually, we should not travel. So this dialectics of travel and stability, of thinking about different, colorful, intensive cities and being really consciously deciding to stay in Lwów at that time, not to move to another big city, stay there, feel marginalized, and feel the heaviness of all the burdens that came with the everyday life. She had a small child that she had to care for. She had family issues and aging mother that also needed help. So she consciously decides not to move. And this is from this experience of being, interested in this intense experience of urban metropolis, of urban modernism, and in being in a periphery that is also modern and urban, this is the place where her art and her thinking is born. She, in the late 1920s and 1930s, she became associated with a group called Artes. I am not a historian of the group, but Vogel, I'm a person who is interested in Vogel, and Vogel became one of the leading critics for the group. She promoted the group. She theorized their art, and she actively became engaged with one of the representatives of this group. And I think here of Hendrick Stang, who after the war during the war actually changed his name to Marek Włodarski. So and that's how he is known in the history of Polish art. So Hendrick Stang became the illustrator of all of her works actually, and she thought that really this intensive cooperation and interpretation, sometimes interpretation that Stang offered of her art was really an exciting experience and an interesting experience that she consciously was seeking for. So this group was established in the 1929. There isn't a clear timeline for the group. In the 1933, there is a change in the direction in which the group developed, but basically this group was really, Vogel thought that they were real experimentators, that they were trying to really go further, not to develop different new forms of art. Some of them were educated in Paris, in Académie Moderne of Fernand Léger. And they brought these experiences of the French avant-garde, Cubism, Constructivism, and Légerism into their own art. Then the group developed in the direction of what is called sometimes Surrealism, and started also experimenting with photography. Here you have a photography of Aleksander Krzybobłocki, who was one of the founders of the group before the group actually was established. This is 1928. This photography is called SOS, and I chose it because this group really developed in the crisis years. You can see it 1929, and this group really responded to the crisis, the deep political, social, economic crisis through their art. And what they tried to show, and what Vogel tried to show through her own writing, is that the avant-garde, most radical and avant-garde art actually is an answer to the crisis and is actually socially engaged art in a less obvious and less straightforward way. So I'll show you the development of the group through the work of Hendrick Stang, who was the closest to Vogel. Here you have his Hairdresser, 1925, a very clear influence of Fernand Léger and his geometric art here. And a certain mechanicism that Vogel observed, and here these mannequin-like figures become also important characters of Vogel's poems and prose. Then here you see this direction development. This is an abstract composition simply of Streng, and here you see his another graphic of his called Figures in the Landscape, that reminds us perhaps more of the art of Giorgio De Kiriko, a painter, an Italian painter that kept fascinating. Also, I mean, that was important part of the Parisian intellectual and artistic milieu, and that kept fascinating Vogel herself. And then this turn to surrealism. Here you see Streng's graphic, a family in an interior with arcades. And moving forward, although backwards in time, this is a collage, actually, not a photomontage, but it's called photomontage, an early example of an experimentation with this technique within the artists that were later associated with the group. Here I would like to quote Vogel's article about the genealogy of photomontage and its potential, here translated by Benjamin Paloff, published in a catalog of the exhibition. The catalog was published both in Polish and in English versions. There is another translation by Anastasia Lubas in her great collection of translations of Vogel. I will show it by the end of the lecture. Vogel writes here, and she became one of the most important art critics thinking theoretically about photomontage at that time. The legend of modernity is a fact. In this way, today's photomontage must become the counterpart of the literary genre of reportage and fact montage, or also montage, literary montage as such, that she was practicing. There arises a question for art. Which facts are important? That is to say, it may turn out that facts that are weighty and occupy a great surface of life will turn out pointless to life itself and consequently to form, even if this fact is a person being shot. It's a very shocking statement, but not every fact is important. Or actually the question is how does art make facts important? So it's not enough to paint a dead person, a shot person. the role of art is to turn this into visual reality that will show you the nature of what happened and why it happened, and will help you see this not in a generic way, but actually see and experience this, and not just to walk away from yet another painting or yet another photography, as we think today, of a refugee, let's say. Beyond that, the question arises of whether a literal fact exists in the first place. Doesn't it also happen that the isolated fact itself, not to mention selection and grouping, is already a certain interpretation of the raw mass of life, and that there are no naked facts? So she says that naked facts are not available to us in our experience. We are always and already interpreting facts. Working with material that just happens to be found in illustrated magazines, as we saw with Stang before, and among reproductions is insufficient. These newspaper clippings reek of junk and cheapness. They're too unrefined in their naive situation naturalism. The belief that authentic life is caught in this manner is incorrect. We must venture the position that facts become authentic only in their capture, and thus already in a certain interpretation of real life substance. This principle of as if genuine turns the reality of life into the real. And this is the experience of the real that the modern radical art offers to its viewers and to its readers. This is it. This is a tragic and really urgent, attempt to answer to the crisis of these years. Here I'm showing you a few other examples of different experiments. This is another collage of Jerzy Janisz, a member of the group, and here photomontages, I think, of the most interesting artists of the group when it comes to photography and photomontage, Aleksandr Krzywobłocki. A few other examples. And here you have I started with the position of Vogel being marginalized and was woman, and you must have remarked this, that there were very few women in the avant-garde movement as such, and they were marginalized. And in this group, there were also not so many women, but they were important artists. Here you see Margit Reich-Sielska, who was associated with the group as portraited by Aleksandr Krzywobłocki. So Vogel also not only wrote art criticism and not only promoted this group of artists through her own writings, but she wrote her own poetry and prose that was an attempt to translate the visual revolution that happened in art from Cubism on into the language of literature. And here comes another possible solution. And a few authors already mentioned this solution, that her engagement with Yiddish is actually also an answer to her striving to construct a new reality, to dismantle the language and our language habits, and to change the nature of how we write. And it was easier to do it in Yiddish. It was a whole new language for her. And she kept dismantling the language and changing it and constructing new, surprising, unusual word compositions. Compositions that were rejected by most Yiddish critics, we have to admit. The same happens actually in her Polish writings. And she's actually, most of the critics, there are a few favorable reviews that come from such writers as Zofia Naukowska, for example, a Polish modernist prose writer and a famous and not a feminist, but most of them are really unfavorable. And many of them are anti-Semitic, where they say that she cannot write Polish. That's as simple. She's Jewish, she cannot write Polish. And what she attempts actually is to change the language, to change the nature of how you think and what you can write, how you can combine words, and what is a literary representation. So here you see 3 of her volumes. The first one, these are poems, Tokfiguren, Figures of Days. And you see, this is the first poem translated by Anastasia Lubas that was mentioned here, Day Figure, and it tells you a lot of what this volume is. A gray rectangle, a second, a third. 7 times the thin rectangle opens. Yellow sun, red sun, on one side, on another. The day rectangle has closed. Gray tin birds hover. Lumps of soft dough with 2 hands and 2 feet roll in the gray clay of light. 4 times a day. Yellow sun on one side of the rectangle, on the other. A first month of stiff thin flowers. A second, a third. Month of stinky tin flowers, hands and clothes. How many times it has opened? How many times closed? The thin rectangle with the yellow sun circle on both sides. So what she's attempting here is a certain phenomenology of time represented through geometry, through geometrical figures. So she's trying to describe a day, but not a singular individual day that happened with this and that date, but the nature of day as such, our experience of time. So it starts with the grayness, and then it's 7 times, it's a week. And then there's a yellow sun and red sun, so sunrise, sunset, on one day, on one side, on the other. So the time is here represented, the day, as a rectangle. And then we have other figures here that appear on the scene. We have gray tin birds, which might be interpreted as tramways, for example. And these mannequin-like or golem-like figures, lumps of soft dough with 2 hands and 2 feet, which are obviously human beings in the city. 4 times a day, and then the day ends. And then there is more. The time is from a day and a week. Then we have seasons, 3 months. And this is the experience, the monotony. This is the sameness. She really tries here to extract the nature of time, of everyday time experience. So there is this identicness in the multiplicity of the modern urban life. And there's this monotony, this repeatedness that she's trying to capture through her, in her poems. And then she tries to, so this, in this first volume, the city she is describing is a very generic city. There are not very many really individual topographic details that could identify this city. This is an every modern, like an every city, like an every man modern city. And this is an experience of almost everybody in the modern city. But then something else comes. This is a general universal modernist city. And on the other hand, in these poems, she is including her own experience. For example, the experience of grief. While she was writing this volume, her father died. The father that she was very close to. So there are poems that respond to this experience, and she's slowly including in this generalist view of a modern city her own signature. And this is, so reading out of this geometric city her own individual experience is something I find most fascinating. I don't have much time, so I will run a bit here. This is her second volume, Mannequins. And here you have her own attempt, one of the many, because she tried again and again to theorize, to explain her own art, to explain her own ideas. So she really built around her art a lot of commentaries. So she's the thinker of commentary. But she also agreed that she might be misunderstood. And for example, something that she understood as constructivism might be interpreted as surrealism, though she did not feel she was a surrealist. So my discovery, she writes, like all poetic discoveries, consists in showing what is banal, self-evident, and precisely for that reason unnoticed. I adopt a very proximate perspective to these things. It consists in discarding the familiar distance to things the distance that becomes filled with interpretation, which becomes so deeply intertwined with the thing that it becomes in our eyes identical with the thing itself and taken for it. The proximate perspective passes over the cliché that is in the course that in the course of a certain time has accrued over a thing. It wants to see the thing outside the context of interpretation and a fixed label, perhaps without the label it has had up to now. So she said there are no facts without interpretation, but here she's trying to pass over the cliches, the things we're used to seeing things in a certain way. We're used to experiencing things in a certain way. What she tries to do, and what, according to her, the geometric art or so-called abstract art, she didn't like the name abstract art because she thought geometrical art is really striving to capture the reality. So the thing itself and not something abstract. So here she's trying to change our habits of understanding, of interpreting, of seeing, of experiencing. The mannequin motif and the mood of fatalism are likewise connected to urbanism. The similarity of a large number of gestures gives the impression of a mechanical, stereotypical movement, not a unique one. So this is what happened in this poem. This is not a unique city. This is not a unique time experience. It is a mechanical, geometrical time experience that she tried to represent. The mechanical element in a living body, this is the mannequin, the shape of a person with the functions of a machine. So this machine-like human being could be, a positive emblem for modernity, or it could be broken, it could be open, it could be unhappy. It's like these lamps of dawn that we see in Vogel. People in Vogel's art are unhappy. They are experiencing depression, as she was herself in her own personal life, but they're melancholic. Geometry, as we know, since ancient times, was associated with melancholy. So geometrical symbols are melancholical symbols, and Vogel's geometry is a melancholic geometry. So actually what we get from Vogel's art is the melancholic theory of modern life. The corresponding method of for this experience is the lyric of cool statis. This is what she called her first poems, the lyric of cool statis. Is the cross-section. Cross-section is an art term, also a geometrical term. It signifies a stable scheme of gestures and situations. That relative stability is a tantamount to repetition. Repetition is something you saw also in the poem. The cross-section of dynamic experiences contains what is stable and therefore static within them. Monotony, revealed as the structure of reality, can be a life program. Then it signifies the rehabilitated every day, but at the same time, it is a hierarchical and in this way, a heroic worldview. It sees actual value in the hard repetition of a few raw, mundane gestures, in the wonder of movement in general, to the very last. So this wonder of the movement of time and people in time in general is what we saw in the poem. And there is this hierarchy, how you represent and how you construct, but also there is this tragic experience. It opens to tragism. But the next phase, she says in this text, is to rehabilitate all the elements, great lifelines of preparations simultaneously with life monotony, junk and pathos. The new phase is called simultaneity. So what she says is enough of this geometry. There are new needs of time, and she writes it in the time of crisis. And we also see it within the artist group that she was associated with. So they stop experimenting with geometrical art, or they do not stop, but they get interested with the strikes of workers, with the economic crisis. And they start thinking, how do we respond to it through this experimental art? How do we respond not making our art realistic art? How do we find a new realism? That is the question that this group, her milieu, tries to answer in the 1930s. And the answer comes with her volume of montages that is first published in Yiddish as Acacia's Blee and Acacia's Blossom or Bloom. And then with the Polish volume, that the one that was for long the only volume known to the broader public, the volume that was a source for accusations of Vogel of being an epigon of Bruno Schulz, whereas Vogel actually was the more courageous in the pair. And Vogel was the one that traveled. Vogel was the one that really introduced Schulz to many different ideas discussed in the world of modern art. And Vogel was the one that was really also discussing with Vogel as a peer and not as an epigon. So the fact that there appear in both in Schulz and Vogel, we have a figure of mannequin that has a very different meaning to them is not enough to say that Vogel was an epigon. The fact that Vogel is experimenting with prose in a very different way. Vogel really wants to render prose visual, and she doesn't really. What she tries to capture is the nature of the change of forms of art that correspond to the changes in the social and economic world. So this is what she tries to do. Schulz is a very different writer. If you know Bruno Schulz, you will listening about Vogel, you will understand that they're very different writers. They are friends. They are discussing these ideas, but for sure they're not mimicking themselves, one another. Here you have a few graphics of Hendrick Stang to some of the montages of Vogel. Here actually a military parade that you could see more and more of in the 1930s. Vogel really tries to think about what happens in economy, what happens with banks, for example, and the banking crisis, what happens with the rising militarism through her experimental prose, through prose montages. So that's what she does in the 1930s. And she prepared yet another volume that she wanted to publish probably in late 1939, but she was already aware that something's coming. In the letters from this period, she writes, I will publish this volume if something else doesn't come. And yet something else came. Vogel remained in Lwów in 1939 in the Soviet occupied Lwów at that time. She was teaching in a seminary. Before that, she was a teacher in a Hebrew seminary. Then she was lecturing also about Yiddish literature. For example, none other than a professor of the Hebrew University, Chonesh Meruk, was listening to her lectures at that time. And she remained in Lviv until the Germans came in 1941, and when the German-Russian War started in June 1941. She had a chance to hide. She had friends and they offered her a hideout, but she felt that, she was with her husband, with a little boy, her son, with an aging mother, and she felt she didn't have enough in her strength to try to hide. So she rejected this help. She stayed in the ghetto. Her husband was also an official of the Judenrat. The last I think letter we have of hers is a letter sent to her family from that period. We also know that she helped different refugees before Germans came and after. We know little about this period. What we could reconstruct is from different memoirs of people who met her. We know that she was very deeply depressed. Already in the Soviet period, she stopped writing. She didn't publish anything, although her friends kept publishing. And when August 1942 came, and when there was a mass liquidation action in the Lviv ghetto, or Lemberg ghetto, she tried to save her lives and save her and the lives of her loved ones. So they tried to hide, but they were found. They were trying to hide in a store somewhere on Bernstein Street. The street today is called Sholem Aleichem Street, the name, so it bears the name of the Yiddish classic. How do we know that? Because her close friend and the illustrator of her works, Hendrick Stang, that you see here, his graphic here, was working in a commando that was cleaning the ghetto and cleaning the bodies. And he was the one who found the bodies of his close friend. And that's how in this mass death, we can identify the moment and the place where Vogel family was killed. So she was killed, murdered, together with her family in August 1942 in Lwów, the city where she consciously remained, that became the source of her inspiration, the source of her philosophy in writing. She philosophized really, and she wrote literary representations of modernity out of the Lwów streets, and this city that became the site of her murder. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer a few questions. I'll just open the discussion here.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank you so much.
There are many compliments in the chat room, and I'll send you the transcripts so you can read them yourself. Keith asked, are there distinct Yiddish dialects? Could someone in the South understand someone in the northern part of the country? Because Poland is a huge country, could someone in the country understand someone in the city?
Yes, of course. I mean, there were different dialects and sub-dialects. There are three main general Yiddish dialects. So the central dialect, so-called Polish Yiddish, the northeastern dialect, the Litvak Yiddish, and then the southeastern dialect, so the Podolian Yiddish. But then there were many, many sub-dialects, and sometimes, you know, from city to city or from shtetl to shtetl, there would be distinct features of the Yiddish that was spoken, which is normal to languages that are spoken in such a vast area and are diasporic. But even in other languages like German has plenty of dialects as well. But yeah, I mean, it was possible to understand each other, though Yiddish speakers speaking different dialects of Yiddish made fun of themselves, of course. I mean, of other Jews speaking other Yiddish, and this is an important part of Yiddish folklore as well.
Thank you very much. There's a question, I hope I don't destroy the name, by Efrosine. I'm sorry if I destroyed it. She asks if Vogel's work was inspired by French naturalism.
Okay, so Vogel was inspired by French art, but it wasn't French naturalism that inspired her. Firstly, it was, first of all, Cubism and Constructivism, but obviously she knew very well also the French art of the late 19th century. I mean, she was an expert in the history of art, so she knew the history of art very well, but she, as we understand it also today, considered, for example, Cézanne like one of the figures, you know, founding figures in the development of the avant-garde art, and his geometrical vision as something that inspired later on the development of Cubism. Actually, her Hegelian approach to understanding the change, the metamorphosis of art led her to believe that, you know, these changes are necessary and are inevitable. So what she thought also, that each new phase in the art development is a consequence of the previous phase, and the new phase, the new approach to art is never, you know, entirely different or you know, completely independent of the previous phase, which is very important. So when she was herself and the group and her milieu was thinking how to make realist, new realist engaged art, they said we cannot, just, leave cubist and constructivist vision. We have to somehow employ it to create this new realist art. And their answer was montage and photomontage. What is also interesting is how she wants us to see through her prose. So she's using a lot of visual references. Sometimes these are references to specific artworks. Sometimes these are, she calls, for example, different colors. This is a very tactile art. This is a very material language of literature. And she names different colors after different artists. And we see how many of these references are references to French art. So also to French naturalism, but she was not interested in naturalist representation. This was something that was the farthest from her strivings. She thought that naturalist representation is too easy. And what is at stake with geometric art, or what is called otherwise a abstract art, is really seeing the world as it is without the mask of naturalism. And naturalism or realism were also styles that we were led to believe that they do represent reality. And they're also ways of representing, and they're no better or no worse than others. They're different, and they were also responding to a moment in history and in social developments. And abstract art for her, and I will quote, so when we enter the world of abstract art, we are entering an unmasked, unambiguous world, the authentic world of life's most authentic emotions presented in a non-evasive form. And for this reason, one that is maybe so irritating at first glance and so indeed difficult. Here we're moving around the world of particular things in a world where such magnitudes as movements and stillness, the kind and direction of movement, weights, rhythms, and tensions, and even numbers themselves and their rhythm have become things. These abstractions for the usual comprehension and feeling of life are treated here as though they were things within the range of corporeal touch and visual expression, as if we were speaking of the body, landscapes, and fruits and flowers. So here she was, so this is why abstract art is so difficult, but she was really against the neo-naturalistic art and social Soviet social realism. And she thought that the idea of comprehensibility and mass appeal is false, because we are just imagining the masses, the people, and we are being really, we're imposing our intellectual view on the masses. And this is also somehow connected to symbolic violence. So it's a complex idea. It's a complex system on the move. It's a work in progress. She's changing. She's constantly adjusting her thinking to whatever is happening in the art world and in the social and social world. But for sure, she was against like realist or naturalist representation. Oh.
Thank you very much. You mentioned that there has been a recent rediscovery and renewed interest in Vogel. Why do you think this is happening?
Okay, there are many answers. First of all, because she became available. So when I started my work, there was nothing. People knew that of one of her books, the one that was published in Polish, and that this book was studied by Schulz scholars who knew Polish. Obviously, if they were studying Schulz, they knew Polish, and a few articles, including the one on the photomontage. So that's how she functioned on the margins of the discussions in the history of literature and art. So, and when I started my search query, first I came with Yiddish. So I was able to uncover a whole bulk of her work written in Yiddish. And she all of a sudden appeared as a productive, independent, and a very interesting writer that cannot be reduced to this one book. really unjustly classified as an epigonic book. And this was a work at that time, pre-digitization era, that I did in the archives, and really going through many different newspapers in Yiddish, Polish, Hebrew, and German. So this was the first step. So I uncovered, and constructed the whole bibliography. The book is 15 years old now. I found new texts, and based on this research, a new interest was born, first in the field of Polish studies, and then new researchers came, and I will show you one book here. This is a German edition of Vogels' writings. It's bilingual, transcribed Yiddish and translation into German by Anna Maja-Misiak, a researcher, a Polish-born researcher, actually, based in Switzerland. So this is a thick volume, as you can imagine, that all of a sudden made available these writings to another, a whole cohort of researchers who do not know Polish, but are interested in the avant-garde art. And then they came translations into Ukrainian of Jurko Prochasko and Anastasia Lubas. And finally, I should have, maybe I can do it still. I would like to show you these books simply. How do I do it? Perhaps this. I can't find my own presentation, so I won't do it. But the wonderful edition of Anastasia Lubas of the works of Vogel into English right now, this is a game changer. All of a sudden, this writer becomes available. Not only selected poems that were translated earlier, but a whole bulk of writings is available to a whole new group of readers. And Anastasia's book is called Blooming Spaces, the collected poetry, prose, critical writings, and letters of Debora Vogel. And another thing happened. So a few years ago, Poland was celebrating 100 years of avant-garde in Poland, not Polish avant-garde, very important here. And Vogel became one of the central figures of one of the central exhibitions that I, together with two of my colleagues, Andrei Bojarov and Pavel Polit, co-curated in Łódź, in one of the most important museums of modern art in the region and worldwide. But why is that? First of all, she became available, but why does she apply to our sensibilities? So it seems that she was writing ahead of her time, and she was really, really very badly received in her own time. And right now we have the tools, the intellectual tools, to understand the novelty of her writing and the radicalness of her writing, and she applies to our contemporary modern sensibilities. And she touches something important, be it really her socially engaged art or her, visual language. After so many revolutions in the visual art, we're ready for her. And she doesn't seem her art simply has a space in our contemporary audiences, within our contemporary audiences. So that's why. And she really touches on different topics. For example, the commodification of the female body, her feminism that is not a straightforward feminism, but she has a very strong feminist look at what's happening in the modern world. Her radicalness, her political engagement, all of that, I think, combined with a language that still surprises, although we're ready, that is still surprising, and this does something to our habits of reading, and that is not easy, and makes us work through it, and opens to so many interpretation. And you can really play Vogel with different philosophers, contemporary philosophers. You can juxtapose her with different thinkers and writers, and this is and because it was a work in progress, because her writing is an open project, she's not really, she cannot be defined in one framework. And this is also something that is exciting about her. And then there comes the Yiddish part. So she's one of the most avant-garde radical writers in Yiddish. And here we are in this moment, I mean, we've been there for a while, for quite a few decades, when we're rediscovering women writers in Yiddish. And now comes this writer that is so radical and so different from many other writers that we already rediscovered through translation projects and through research. So there's yet another aspect to this, so that she does not quite fit into the history of Yiddish avant-garde. She changes something. She makes us see an alternative line of development of Yiddish or Jewish avant-garde. As such, her proposition is different, and she helps us think through, the way we think about history of art in the field of both Jewish or Polish German studies. So that's why I think she becomes so central, and not only for researchers or readers, but also for different artists. Different artists engage with her art in their projects. So that tells you how productive, how interesting and fascinating her work is.
Thank you very much. Your answer actually is leading to Sergei's question. I hope I can read this correctly as well. Josefa Kratochwala Widimashka. I'm so sorry. She also illustrated Vogel's prose. Were there any other connections between them?
Okay, and not that I know of, but yeah, you're right. She illustrated her very important article about Lwów's Jewish quarter. It's a very fast, I mean, again, if we think about Vogel positioning herself in the space of the city of Lwów, it's very important because she positions herself within this modern space that I was showing to you, and not within the Jewish quarter, the space that is for her outside of time and on the peripheries of the modern city. And all of a sudden she walks through this city as a tourist, and looking for exotic experiences. And she's very conscious of this position of her. So she's looking very stereotypically at this Jewish space that is her own and not her own. She's this modernized, acculturated, comes from this acculturated family. She came back to Yiddish, but Yiddish as a medium of modern art, not as a medium of traditional culture. And yes, and she walks through this quarter, and all of a sudden she really signs her own signature off on the space because she remembers her great-grandfather and her grandfather. And all of a sudden this becomes her space, and she understands that this distance and this outlook on Yiddish culture is wrong, and what we have to see is the life as it is, without this exoticizing framework. And she uses Kratochwila's graphics for that reason. They're very simple. They're scenes from the Jewish quarter. With no exoticism. They're not typical, stereotypical representations of the Jewish space or of the Jewish figures. And I think she engaged with Kratochwila for that very reason, this everydayness that became very important tool for Vogel. She was interested in representing the everyday, also the urban folklore. So Kratochwila here, it's not Vogel's avant-garde representation, but she's in dialogue with Vogel's attempt to de-exoticize the Jewish space. But regrettably, perhaps there are some links, personal links to discover. Vogel's whole family archive, her home archive, was thrown away. She left her archive in her own apartment on Leszna. And these papers supposedly, as Jerzy Ficowski says, survived the war, but when they were cleaning the house, these were thrown, the papers of the previous inhabitants were simply thrown away. So perhaps there would be more documents to prove the connection between the two authors, the personal connection. They must, whether they had personal contacts. This is something I don't know. If somebody knows, I'm very happy to learn about it. And thank you for this question.
Thank you very much. Sergey also asked if Vogel somehow is connected to Maria Lillian.
So I mean, so the group. I don't know of any personal contacts between her, but then again, we're missing the whole. We're missing the whole archive. You saw Maria Lillian on one of the photographs, I think. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know of her personal connection, but this was a person who would be in her milieu, and then an architect as well. And Vogel was very much interested in architecture, but somebody from her immediate milieu. So I bet that there would be some immediate context that I cannot describe due to the lack of information. What we can reconstruct is, you know, her correspondence with Yiddish intellectuals, because these were sent off to New York, or her correspondence with Israeli intellectuals, because these were sent to Eretz Israel, Palestine at that time. So these are things that we are able to reconstruct, or some documents that were saved, but we are missing the internal Lwów connection. So we can reconstruct it from the press. We can, for sure, what is, I mean, we can, you know, with the certain amount of exactness, think where she would go, what were the venues she would visit, etc., and what were who were the people she was meeting. But I don't have any immediate, I mean, like personal documents that could say anything more to that topic. That doesn't mean that they don't exist. During the 15 years that passed from the time that the book was first published, I found so many other documents, and not only me. Recently, for example, a filmmaker actually, who made a movie about different female intellectuals from Lwów. He discovered also a lot of new documents. This is, I'm mentioning here the recent article in the Schulz Forum, and the author, the filmmaker's name is Piotr Szalsza. So there are many documents to be discovered, and I'm sure that there is something, and the research is not finished simply.
Thank you very, very much. There are a few more questions that I'm gonna have to skip over. So Bill has a question, is what caused you to go study Jewish studies?
Oh, that's not the topic, but yeah, I usually answer, I was asked this question so many times, and I'm trying to not to theorize what is a personal connection, first of all, and what was a decision of a teenage girl. So Yiddish was one of the languages of my family, and early on as a teenager, I decided I want to know what's written in Yiddish. That was, I had no access to the books. I decided that I want to learn the language and study it, and that's what happened. So there is this, but I was a teenage girl. Teenage people really come up with different ideas what they want to do, and I really, this is what I remember. But I can be right now, you know, having this, you know, I want to read those books that nobody is reading. It sounds very well, so I'm trying to be very cautious of what I'm thinking. But for sure, this is a language that I could speak still in my family. So. Something that was a personal connection. And then I was born in Poland, and it makes so much sense to, and it's not easy for different reasons, but it makes so much sense to do Jewish studies in Poland when you really want to understand Polish history and Polish culture better, and to change something in the place you were born. So. But this is something you know, it sounds nice and it sounds idealistic. So I am very cautious of, you know, the reasons. I was a teenager and it was interesting. I had no access to something and I wanted to have an access to something. That's also, this could be the story.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Once again, thank you all for being here from all over the world. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to open the microphones and Laila Tov from Jerusalem.
Okay, so if somebody wants to ask a question, I saw also a question by Natalia Alexion, Professor Natalia Alexion, who was asking about her interest, I think, in the Ukrainian literature. This is an interesting and yet to be explored topic. So how Yiddish, for example, intellectuals were interested in the Ukrainian literature and art. For example, I mean, for sure, artists and her milieu. This is a Polish Jewish Ukrainian milieu. That's something that is clear. And she herself wrote about the Ukrainian painters. So this is a direct connection. She didn't write about Ukrainian literature. This is something that Rochel Auerbach, so one of her closest friends, wrote about. So for sure, this network of different people and different cultures and languages is something that kept also animating her thinking and her actions. So yes, there are not many, but there is some writing of hers devoted to these topics. And then there are many personal connections.
So if we started, the last question that I skipped over was by Budan, and he writes, her perception of reality and realism is strikingly similar to Buddhist doctrine. Was she knowledgeable of the Eastern philosophy? Thank you for a great lecture.
Thank you for this question. I saw it. I don't have a good answer. She was knowledgeable about philosophy for sure. This is not a topic she wrote a lot about, but she also had some, some habits, some writing habits. So she kept quoting the same authors. When she had a good quote, she kept quoting same authors again and again. So there's no like serious engagement with Eastern philosophy within her writings, but it is impossible to think that she wouldn't be knowledgeable about Eastern philosophy. The Yiddish avant-garde group that she was associated with loosely, she considered herself a member. I don't think they considered her a member. So the New York In Sich group was very much engaged, for example, in the Eastern philosophy, and in their manifesto, they mention Eastern philosophy. So I can't imagine she wouldn't be knowledgeable. That's my tentative answer. I really would like to thank you for all those wonderful questions and comments. I want to copy them all. I will actually do that.
I'll send you the transcript.
Okay, because they're super inspiring. And even though I can't answer all the questions very precisely, they make me think, and also they make me search. And I hope I'm not the only one. I know I'm not the only one searching and thinking about Vogel. But they open so many different ways to approach Vogel that I mean, coming here, I didn't imagine that this would happen. So thank you so much for being such an inspiring audience.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you all once more. The microphones are still open if anyone wants to say anything. And once again, Laila Tov from Jerusalem.